right.
All right,
So everyone
welcome
see my screen?
everyone to this week's Rising Tide Foundation lecture, where we are continuing our exposition, our exploration of science unshackled. There's obviously certain the domain of science is not what it used to be, and I think we're all here because we recognize that. The idea of science is the pursuit of truth, the discovery of new principles of the universe, and the application of the fruits of those discoveries in the form of technological progress that allows human beings to always overcome at every stage of the game the limits to growth, which are always pressing upon us based upon our ignorance or the lack of discoveries we have yet to make of the nature of the universe. There's always going to be limits to what we can do. But those limits, unlike the other beasts that we find within the ecosystems of the earth, which are perfectly fine for what they are not capable of doing what the human being does. And that used to be science. That used to be the domain of discovery. And unfortunately, under the political dynamics that have been shaping or misshaping the past generations, that tradition has sadly fallen to the wayside. And instead, what we tend to have masquerading as science is something that looks a little bit more like obedience to experts that have a sort of popular agreement amongst themselves that everyone should adopt that opinion, whatever it might be, even if it runs contrary to the interests of the species that should benefit from the fruits of science. So one of the big things that I think has been an unfortunate consequence of this misdefinition of science has been the shutdown of a lot of the vital energy systems that we have needed to, or that we once celebrated and once developed as the basis of our own development, the meeting of our basic needs. You know, things like the atomic realm, atomic science used to be something which was understood to be our common heritage. You know, regardless of what culture we're from, we're made of atoms. We live in a universe of atoms, and those atoms, when they're discovered and through knowledge, release a lot of energy that could be used to do a lot of good. Inversely, if we allow empires to run amok, that power can do a lot of bad. But the thing that has allowed us to permit or willingly go along with the shutdown of our vital energy security, our energy sectors, as we've seen now last week with Germany celebrating the shutdown of their last 3 nuclear reactors, is fear and ignorance, which usually run together. And part of that, which is why my friend Hügo is here to speak to us all today, is because this fear of the invisible is something which can only be overcome when we have knowledge of what is really beyond the senses. When the mind's eye learns to see rather than just our sensual eyes, but when the mind's eye sees with understanding, we no longer are afraid, and we can start harnessing these powers for great goods. So there's a lot of pseudoscientific fallacies that have justified the fear that has really wrapped itself around the zeitgeist over several generations. And one of the big ones, several of the big ones, Hügo is going to deal with. And Hügo is a structural engineer, somebody who's got a multifaceted approach and appreciation for science, politics, geopolitics. And I had the pleasure of being on his podcast a little while ago. There's a lot of really great interviews that Hügo has done with leading experts in the domain of energy policy from all over the world. And I'm going to have a link to those who want to know more about Hügo and his work and the podcast in the description box of this video. So Hügo, without saying any more, the stage is all yours. Thank you so much. Oh, no, Hügo, you are on mute, or I cannot hear your voice right now.
Hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Can you also screen just for clarity?
Yeah, we could see your screen.
You see this one? Okay. Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. Just clarify something. I am a structural engineer, but I have a master's in civil nuclear power. So I've got a bachelor's in civil engineering and then a master's in sort of designing nuclear structures. So I'm actually competent in what I'm going to say over here today. So the title of this lecture is Energy Competence, Humanity, and the Fallacy of the Linear No Threshold Model. So it's sort of structured into two lectures. The first one is on energy, and then the second one will be on what we call LNT, Linear No Threshold. And it'll become clear as we go on why I do it that way. So first, I like starting with definitions whenever I present. I'm an engineer. So the question is, what is energy? Energy is the capacity for doing work. It's a very obvious definition. And it's one of the few places in science where something we say in everyday life in a vernacular sense actually has a similar meaning in a physical sense. If you say somebody's a good worker, he's got a lot of energy, it means he's got a lot of capacity for work. Now, I've got two quotes here by Richard Feynman. The first quote is, he says, there is a fact, if you wish, a law governing all natural phenomena that are known to date. It is there's no known exception to this law. It is exact as far as we know. The law is called the conservation of energy. It states that there is a certain quantity for which we call energy that does not change in manifold changes, which nature undergoes. Then Richard Feynman has another quote that would seem a little bit contradictory to the first one. I'll explain now why. And he said, it's impossible to realize that in physics today, we have no knowledge of what energy is. We do not have a picture that energy comes in little blobs of a definite amount. Okay, so first time he says there's a law called the law of conservation of energy. And in the second sentence, he says we don't actually know what energy is. And what he means by that is energy is actually not something you can see on a microscope. You don't see bulbs of energy. You can see light. That's maybe a form of energy, some people would argue. You cannot really see heat. You can measure heat, right? Things of that sort. But we know there's this fixed quantity that changes form. And that's what we used to call energy. So when I go to units, how we measure energy, if you go to SI units, the basic units, okay, Newton is actually a kilogram meter per second square, but I stick with Newton. So if you say energy, we measure that in joule, that's a Newton times a meter. It's got the same unit as a torque that the people who drive cars would know. Then if you look at power, it's watt, it's a joule per second. So it's the rate of doing energy. You'll see the media confuses energy and power all the time. So power, it's Newton times meter per second. Then when we talk electricity generation, we take watts times seconds. That comes to joule, and that's Newton times meter. So electricity generation is in the same units as energy, right? If we talk of a kilowatt hour, we can actually say just a joule. So that's energy consumed. So that means if I say a generator, my electricity is generating energy, the generator has worked. Yeah, it's worked because it's actually used energy. All right. If we go to just look a little bit back in the past, before the Industrial Revolution, we would say that the rapid industrialization began in Britain, starting in the 1780s, with high rates of growth of steam power and iron productions after the 1800s. So we escaped the constraints of animal and muscle power thanks to energy. The difference between the 17th and the 18th century is coal. We'll see that a bit later. So here's a quote written by Karl Marx during the Industrial Revolution, where he said, wind was too inconsistent and uncontrollable, and besides in England, the birthplace of modern industry, the use of water power preponderant even during the manufacturing period. Then he makes a quote and he says, in the 17th century, attempts had already been made to turn 2 pairs of milestones with a single water wheel, but the increased size of the gearing was too much for water, which had now become insufficient. And this was one of the circumstances that led to a more accurate investigation of the laws of friction. So this is from Das Kapital. And Karl Marx in Das Kapital realized here in the 17th century, in the 18th century, something changed significantly. And he sort of figured out is we don't use water anymore, we were using steam. And what you would realize is if you look at the abolition of slavery, it ties in with what Karl Marx was saying. Slavery was first abolished in 1804. That was more of a rebellion against the French. And then Britain had his Slave Abolition Act in 1833. France 1848, America followed in 1865. So even though America started a bit late with the Emancipation Proclamation, it's from a relative point of view not much different than when Britain and even Haiti abolished slavery. It's within the same century. And why is that? Well, the reason is we were dependent on animals and humans, unfortunately, for energy needs before James Watt came with the steam engine. And I make the case that the abolition of slavery was not possible without other forms of energy. It's simply impossible. Human societies would have collapsed. It's an inconvenient truth, but I think that is the harsh truth of it. So here's an article that was written. I take this from an article written by the economist Tony Wrigley. And during the Industrial Revolution, they wanted to explain the economists at the time wanted to explain why did we have exponential growth? What allowed for that to happen? And the three classical economists of the time was Adam Smith, Thomas Malthus, and David Ricardo. And they had theories on growth that was based on production, land, labor, and capital. And depending on which one they went for, that was sort of the explanation. It's more efficient use of land. It's more efficient use of labor. Labor cost was rising. These guys had capital, but these are abstract concepts, and they're not actually, except for maybe labor, well defined, or even land for that matter. But how does capital different from land? And it didn't really make sense. So Tony Wrigley looked into this, and he said, well, societies whose productive capacities were limited by the annual production of photosynthesis operated within severe and seemingly unmovable constraints. He called these organic societies. Organic society is a society whose primary source of energy is photosynthesis, and it might be manpower. And if they were lucky to have animals on the Eurasian or European landmass, you had maybe another source of energy. But those energy sources put significant constraints on growth. And he would go on to say it's because of fossil fuels that we were released from these constraints. Whether the immense benefits were made possible will prove durable and stable, and it remains an open question. Now, I'm going to make an argument here which is a little bit Malthusian. If we run out of energy one day, the societies will revert back to organic society. Energy is the underpinning of the modern world. Without it, we will go back probably to slavery and using animals. So if you compare England to Italy for the period of the Industrial Revolution, you will see that Italy's energy usage was severely restrained because they did not have the discovery of coal yet. And Tony Wrigley came to the conclusion that England was lucky because coal was found very high on the surface. So the rheology of coal allowed for England to pass the Industrial Revolution. Take into account that the Netherlands actually became a modern society before England, but England took off from the Netherlands around the time of the discovery of coal. So you will hear in the media a lot today the question of an energy transition. I mean, it's sort of spouted that we're moving to transition to net zero. Solar and wind is going to replace everything. But what is meant by an energy transition? Well, if you take the transition from, say, wood and animals and slave labor to coal, that took about 50 years in most countries. Coal took to start exploiting oil took another 50 years, and natural gas, well, this graph, I think, it's still an open question from the 1930s onwards to, I think, what's the 1980s here. It's got up a little bit, but it'll take 50 years before gas starts substituting coal and crude oil. And so we'll see later, we don't really replace coal and crude oil. We haven't even replaced wood. We just add it to the consumption needs. And then modern renewables, this is 2015, is still only 5% of the global demand. It's gone up a little bit. So it's an open question if renewables will replace the energy demand that is required. Now, if we look at the primary energy consumption in the world, for example, you will find that modern renewables still make up a very small percentage of all energy needs. So everyone that's saying that we're going to move to net zero by 2030 or 50, they are asking major demands on the economy. Because as you can see, not even coal has really peaked. It's a questionable if coal has peaked. And I saw an article last year that said even coal has not peaked yet with the expansion of China. So coal and oil still makes up the majority of the energy demand of the world worldwide. The big mistake that commentators make is that they always confuse energy with electricity. Electricity is a subset of energy, and I'll explain that in a few seconds. So just something else that's an interesting factoid. These are the amount of proven oil reserves worldwide, and this is the much of gas-powered reserves. And from an economist's point of view, we have more reserves now than any point in history. So we just got better at discovering oil, we got better at using it more intensely, and also natural gas at the same thing. Now, it's a question because obviously you come to a point where you reach physical limits, and theoretically speaking, the oil reserves should run out one day, but thus far we haven't. And many economists are now saying that we're going to stop using oil and gas long before we run out of it. It remains to be seen. Okay, so this argument comes from the Ultimate Resource. It was a debate between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich. Matthew spoke about this a little bit earlier about Malthusian constraints. And Julian Simon figured out that if you take any basket of minerals, and any basket of materials or any item for that matter, the price has gone down relative to the amount of hours that workers work. So from an economist's point of view, we have more resources than ever before. And availability of resources it's a strange metric, but it's calculated by what is called the Simon Abundancy Index. And a way to think of it is engineers are the worst at this, and I'm an engineer, I say that. We tend to think of resources as stocks, and we tend to think of it like it's water in a can that's going to drain out. But if you think of it, the amount of water that we have available today is the same amount as at the time of the Big Bang. It's just a question that the form of the water has changed. You might have sewage water and you need to clean it first. And if you think of resources as a flux as opposed to a stock, it'll make a lot more sense. Now, what do you need to move this flux around is obviously energy. And that is why energy is so indispensable to the industrial economy. Now, this is a graph that will probably get you censored on YouTube. But if you look at the impact of modern medicine on life expectancy, you will find that even tuberculosis declined by something like 70–80% before antibiotics was invented. And it's even questionable from this curve if antibiotics played a role. Now, I'm not making a case that don't use antibiotics. I think they're wonderful, but it just puts things in perspective. It's not true that modern medicine brought down increased life expectancy. The same is true of vaccination. In fact, there is no known relationship between vaccination and the decline of disease. Measles deaths were down 90% before they started vaccinated. And this is the anti-vax graph that people like Anthony Fauci will never show you. So whatever your view on the medications, just know that it's just not true that they increase life expectancy. In fact, modern medicine only contributed to about 3% of life expectancy, and that includes surgery, which has an obvious benefit. So as Robert Gordon showed in the book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, 5 networks: transportation, electrification, water and sanitations. Well, actually, the 4 networks increased life expectancy, and then we came with telecommunications. And it's questionable if telecommunications improve life expectancy, but it definitely improved the human experience. We can now send cat videos to everyone, and it's questionable if that makes us more productive. But he's basically made the argument, if you take the house from the 17th century and compare it to the house of the 20th century, the only difference is these 5 networks. That is also, if you take your kitchen from the 1950 to the kitchen of today, nothing has changed except maybe a microwave. It's not true that technological advancement has been as great as people think. The only advancement has been on the role of atoms, of the role of bits, not in the world of atoms. So definitely computers have gotten better since the 1970s, but cars and things of that sort have changed marginally. And that's because we reach physical limits. So then there's another interesting graph here, which comes from NASA in 2019. And they asked the question, compared to the year 2000, has the Earth gotten greener or less green? So they have what they call the leaf index, so leaf area index, measured by satellites. And what you find is that the areas in the world that has had the most greening, first of all, is North America, because many people in North America, many cities and towns industrialized in the beginning of the last century. And then but the majority of the greening came actually from India and China. And it's actually in India and China where most of the development took place. So it's simply not true that human development leads to deforestation. Actually, I argue the inverse is true. Where I'm from in South Africa, you see that in Johannesburg and Pretoria, which is one of the most urbanized areas on the African continent, you have green area actually. But if you take the province of Natal, for example, in the south, where there's a lot of poverty still, admittedly so, you find a lot of browning. So where people are poor in the Amazon areas, and Sahel, places of that sort, you will find deforestation. Of course, there's also climatic effects. I don't think anyone can make the argument that Australia was much poorer 20 years ago, or was much richer 20 years ago than today. So I'm not discounting climatic arguments, but I'm just pointing out the fact that where people have moved into cities, where there's been massive development, nature was allowed to recover. So there's this interesting quote by, I think it's Matt Ridley, where he's asked the question, why are wolves increasing, lions decreasing, and tigers holding steady? And he makes the argument that wolves are in rich countries, lions in poor countries, and tigers are in middle-income countries. So that's always a nice picture to keep in mind, that as countries develop, we also have more money to save the animals and more for the environment, actually. So now, just to get to energy itself, This is total energy consumption in the United States. It comes from Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. It's for 2021, so not much I think has changed since then. And if you take electricity, as I mentioned earlier, it's actually a small component of all energy used in the economy. If we take industrial energy, commercial energy, residential energy, transportation, they make up the bulk of the energy demand. And the interesting thing to notice in the United States, and it's true elsewhere as well, is that 2/3 of all energy is lost through degradation. This is not true, however, for wind and solar. Why is that? Because when you generate electricity, you're making you're burning water essentially, and it is the Rankine cycle and the conversion of water to steam, energy transfer, of water to electricity, where the turbine spins, where 2/3 of the energy is lost in the system. The same is true of combustion of a car. So the logic of the energy transition is to electrify everything. To move to electrical cars would mean that we lose less energy in the system. So I'm all in favor of electrical cars. Of course, there's a question of range and other questions to play. But essentially, we are trying to eliminate combustion. That is what the energy transition is about. The less fossil fuels we use, you'll always hear. What they're talking about is combustion because you're trying to eliminate the losses. Now, if you take solar and wind, they have the ability to have barely any losses in the system. And that gives them a slight advantage, but they have a disadvantage, which is the intermittency, and they have a 30% capacity factor. So if you take 100 megawatt of solar, you have about 100 megawatt after the losses, and with a 30% capacity factor, if assuming it runs for 1 hour, you have 30 megawatt hour. If I take 100 megawatt of nuclear energy, you have 33 megawatt after losses because you take into account 2/3, but with almost 90% capacity, I also end up with 30 megawatt hour. This is assuming I use my nuclear power only to generate electricity. If I use it to generate heat for commercial industrial purposes, I can reduce this factor significantly. And that is why a lot of thinkers are looking into trying to use nuclear to heat buildings. In China, they've done that, for example, and to try and find other applications for it. So I make the argument, I'm not against wind and solar. I think they are great for where they're applicable. But I make the argument that if we are serious about decarbonization and climatic change and things of that sort, we need to also exploit nuclear power, and we are not untapping the potential. And I'll explain later why that's the case. This is a cost comparison by Lazard. It came out last week, I believe. And this is the Vogtle nuclear power plant that I believe it was built in Georgia, the United States. Now, taking into account, this is a power plant that was over budget, as expensive as it is. And the metric that they use is called the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity. Now, there's been a lot of critique against this metric because they say it doesn't take into account integration cost into the system. But if you compare take the cost of nuclear, it is expensive. It is $115, I believe, per megawatt hour. Now, that compares to about the same these days as wind and solar plus storage, right, which is this one here. It's not much different, and then it depends where you build it. Now, if you build it faster and better, you can get this cost down significantly. But as I'll explain later, this cost is simply too high. And there's a regulatory reason as to why that is the case. But again, we can predict in the next decade, we can easily predict we're going to see the expansion of wind and solar because they have a significant cost advantage. Of course, I believe I'm quite bullish on natural gas being able to be what they call the transition fuel as well. Now, first question would ask is, if fossil fuels are so harmful to the environment, why do we use them? And the simple answer is because they work. The reason is, if you take methane, for example, it's got about 3 times the energy density by volume as hydrogen. And this means that if I have a car that runs on a long distance truck that runs on natural gas, for example, I can get 3 times the distance as hydrogen, just in the physics. Or I can get 3 times the load for the same distance. So any product that has to compete against fossil fuels has to compete on this basis. Fossil fuels also has the enormous advantage that they are dispatchable. You can take a can of gas and you can put it anywhere. You can't do that necessarily for uranium, and you can't do that for wind and solar. So when it comes to transport, when it comes to the applications of energy outside of electrical domain, we're running into physical problems where fossil fuels might end up being the most efficient. And that's why a lot of thinkers are saying we should use synthetic fossil fuels, and we should try and change sewage into methane. There's lots of options on the table, but I don't discount the possibility that we use fossil fuels in the future. Then electrical vehicles, so just news reports, the police in London said they were not suitable. They were basically going flat. So, you know, if a policeman has an electrical car and it runs flat, it can't chase after somebody that runs on a petrol car, for example. Also, if you take pump storage, hydro power, they are great as well, but they limited by geography and catchment areas. But all the pump storage in the United States would run its grid for 3 hours, while the installed battery storage would run it for 5 minutes. At this present moment in time, there's not enough batteries and pump storage installed to replace fossil fuels. And Michael Kelly wrote this article, Energy Utopias and Engineering Reality. Then also hydrogen. There's, I mean, hydrogen to me, the H I think is for hype, frankly. This was an article on France 24 and it was done by the astronomist Michael Kruger, and he described these numbers as dazzling. He would say it would require wind turbines covering 5,000 square kilometers, photovoltaics for 1,000 square kilometers, or 16 nuclear reactors just to supply Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport. Charles de Gaulle is about the same size, I believe, as John F. Kennedy Airport. So imagine you have 16 nuclear reactors to make the hydrogen just to run the airplanes. And then on top of that, you have an issue with the range of the airplane not getting further enough, and all the other physical constraints and hydrogen going boom and bust. It's a big task. So aviation, the physicists and engineers are scratching their head as to what to do. There's a lot of promises that you can replace with hydrogen, but if you look at just the basic physics from fundamental principles, it's questionable if that's going to work. Then this is, I think, also important graph for saying to point out just the constraints in the system other than just electrical generation. And that is that solar and wind take up enormous amounts of land. And we're seeing land conflicts in the United States. We are seeing people with environmental concerns over solar and wind. But if you take the amount of space that a nuclear power station takes relative to wind and solar, it's a very tiny dot. So I make the argument nuclear is energy dense, it's area dense, and it's not as material, it doesn't have the high material demand. Because for all these solar and wind farms that you're going to build, you're going to have to mine the materials to get them. And where do you get that? And then you run into other issues like labor issues in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, many issues associated with it. It is true, however, that solar and wind has come down in costs. That's just a fact. And they've dropped significantly in terms of generating electricity. But if you look at installed capacity in Europe, it's questionable. Please don't read this graph as an absolute truth. If they have brought down the costs, because in Germany and Denmark, they have the highest electricity prices in Europe. But I have to add, they are highly taxed here. They shift the cost to the households. And there's a lot of what ifs that the people have explained to me to this. And there's some cases wind and solar is definitely cheaper. So, but I'm just making a point that you should always distinguish between generating electricity at one point and then actually using it to be on time, ready when needed. And between that, there's transmission lines, there's managing the grid, there's managing demand, there's a lot of things going on. And that price is very difficult, I think, to establish on a spreadsheet even. This is electricity prices in Europe, and you will see France that has nuclear power. Whereas France now comes in below the European average. It's doing quite well. Of course, you have some of the Scandinavian countries, like Norway, that's very cheap, but they're lucky because they have the geography for hydro. We see countries burning coal still make up the cheapest price in Europe. And it's questionable if Eastern European countries are going to go along with the energy transition, because it means, in the short term at least, an increase in the price of electricity. And that's a price that is generally carried by the poorest households. Must take into account energy, because it's so quintessential for economic development, is always something that can swing an election. So in France, in 2019, the Gilets jaunes riots took place on the basis that Emmanuel Macron increased the price of diesel by just a few cents. And before you knew it, you had nationwide protests. So politicians are always very cautious about messing with energy, even if they say in public they're in favor of transitions. Privately, they'll be far more cautious because the price can really swing an election. This is Germany's power mix. And I always make the distinction between energy production and energy consumption. It's true that Germany does produce a lot of solar and wind power, and this graph is outdated. I think they've installed more and they've taken nuclear power off the grid. But if you look at their consumption, renewables still make up a small percentage of all of the energy used in Germany. This is all energy, it's not electricity. You'll see that natural gas still make up a great percentage of Germany's energy need. This graph shows it a little bit better. This compares France to Germany. France has 80–90% of its electricity comes from nuclear power. So we can see, so I compare this one. Okay, this is energy and this is electricity. So energy is on the left, electricity is on the right. You'll see the majority of France's electricity is green. Okay, if you include nuclear as green. In Germany, because they phased out their nuclear plants recently, they now have an issue where fossil fuels make up a majority of the grid. But if you look at total energy consumption, yeah, it's true, France has a little bit more of that. But even in France, fossil fuels still make up the majority of energy consumption. That's an inconvenient fact. It's not admitted in France because it means that in terms of electricity, there's actually very little to do in France. It's to get the transport infrastructure ready if we want to transition to electrical fleet. And in France, it will technically be possible because we have short distances. But in Canada and the United States, it's going to be far more difficult because Canadians and Americans and South Africans, for that matter, travel a very long distance to work. It's not inconceivable for us to go 100, 150 kilometers every day. In France, it's you're almost across the country if you do it that way. Then this was in 2022, last year. Germany shuts down its remaining 6 nuclear power stations. And then 6 months later, the Dutch and the Germans and the Austrians were reverting back to coal. I don't know why Germany did this. I can only base it on what I'm going to say later about why there's radiophobia, but there's something in the German political scene that is completely hostile to nuclear power, and it's not based on scientific or rational evidence. But in the rest of Europe, the public opinion is more in favor of nuclear power. And I think even in Germany now, we're seeing public opinion in favor of nuclear power, but the general elites in Germany are very skeptical about it. So this is the developing world where I'm from. It's always important to point out that by the end of this century, 40% of the world's population will be African. And Nigeria will surpass the United States as the 3rd largest country based on current demographic projections. Nigeria is considering to invest into nuclear energy. China is hinging. This was on a $440 nuclear bailout. So I don't think it's a bailout. I think it's a good investment. And India, is saying that they will look at net zero by 2070. Now, this is not because India doesn't care about the environment. It's because India is a developing country. And Buhari, the president of Nigeria, said in 2021 that the climate crisis will not be fixed by causing an energy crisis in Africa. And the reason is if energy prices go up by a fraction in Africa, we can easily sit with revolutionary change. So this is world population by the year 2100. As we can see, by the year 2100, Europe and North America's population is not going to change much. And the reason for that is you're already urbanized. People who live in cities, the fertility rate of women is about 2.2 children per woman, and I think in the United States it's now less than 2, but it's generally below or at population replacement rate. Of course, in Africa, we are urbanizing. And because Africa is urbanizing, it is going to be the same size as Asia by the end of the century. So Africa will make up 4 out of 10 people on Earth. Asia will be 4 out of 10 people. And the rest of the 2 out of 10 people is spread between North America and Europe and Latin America. And Australia becomes a rounding error, frankly, in the demographic projections. To understand demographics, a lot of it has to do with urbanization. It's a very simplistic demographic transition model. But generally speaking, when countries are in agrarian states, women have 4 to 6 children. Most of them die during childbirth. There's no medication. And the population just replaces itself. The birth and the death rate is about the same. But during the first migration to cities, you have a massive population explosion where the population goes from maybe 6 to 4 or 5 children per woman. In South Africa, this was the case among white South Africans in the 1950s. My mother was one of 6 children. I was one of 4, which was a large family at the time. And today I have 4 children. None of us have had kids yet. And this is normal. I think this is normal in North America and Europe as well. And probably if we have children, it'll be 1 or 2. For the Black South Africans who migrated to the cities in the late 1990s, their fertility rate was 6 when I grew up. You had large Black families, but today it's gone down to 2 as well. They've urbanized at a rapid rate. So after the period of urbanization, you'll find it's about 2 children per woman. And that's been constant across all cultures and societies. And in China today, I think it's even less than 1 because of the one-child policy. So now if you look at just sort of a summary of the electricity scene, it's similar to the previous graph I showed. Just keep in mind, renewable energies still make up a tiny fraction of all energy consumed. And this is a graph by Michael Kelly, who gave the bitter truth that for us to reach net zero by 2030 or 50, we need a herd of unicorns. There's no ways that the world's going to get there, but we can approach it. We can mitigate the damage if we assume that the Earth's going to warm up a little bit. So I'm going to make sort of the case for nuclear power. And I'm going to do it by attacking the nuclear regulators, because I think they are being dishonest with the models that they're using for nuclear safety. I base a lot of this on the work of Wade Allison. He's a professor at Oxford, and I've had the privilege of interviewing him twice and communicating a lot with him. And he wrote this excellent book called Radiation and Reason, the Impact of Science on a Culture of Fear. And he did a lot of studying at Chernobyl and at Fukushima. And interesting thing about Chernobyl is you will notice that the animal life is thriving. Now, why would mammalian life thrive over there but not humans in an area that is said to be a toxic wasteland because of radiation? And the reason is animals don't watch scary Hollywood films. Animals have sense. Humans actually have sense unless we scare them out of it. But the animals are exploding at Chernobyl, despite it being a so-called toxic radiation lab. And I say we need to challenge what is called the linear no threshold model. And that is the claim that ionizing radiation is a carcinogen. I make the argument that it's a very poor carcinogen. Just get back to units of radiation. You always see radiation is generally measured in sievert, Becquerel and sievert, so two units. So 1 Becquerel is the nucleus decay per second. So if you have isotopes of any chemical, for example, if carbon-13 and not 12, the 13 will decay to 12. So it's going to shoot out 1 nucleus. But we measure energy exposure limits in sieverts. Okay, now a sievert represents the equivalent biological dose, biological effect of the deposit of a joule of radiation energy in a kilogram of human tissue. So I've got a human body. If I absorbed 1 joule, that is a radiation dosage. And getting back to electricity generation, a joule, it's a watt per second. So this is going to be a little bit of a bad example, but it's almost if you shock yourself with 1 watt of electricity for a second. Okay, there's different types of decay in radiation, so I'm going to oversimplify this. And you have different types of isotopes: cesium, potassium, radium, strontium. They are all absorbed differently into the body, and there are biological limits on them. Also, you have alpha, beta, and gamma decay. But I'm only going to focus on sievert, which is the broad standard. And it applies to all of this, but just take into account a health physicist, is usually advising a regulator. What I'm criticizing is the limits that the regulator is using. I'm not criticizing the underlying science. So if we look at radiation safety levels based on the sievert rating, this joule that is absorbed by a biological tissue, the recommended limit for radiation workers every 5 years is 100 millisievert. That's about, so if you take 100 divided by 5, it's 20 millisieverts per year. Now, radiation is based on a linear no threshold model. It's the assumption that no dose of radiation is safe. But based in this assumption is the assumption that 100 millisieverts taken at once, an acute dose, will be the same as a worker that has taken 20 millisieverts per year. That is the level of the standard at the moment. So if I take 20 on each year for 5 years consecutively, that's 100 cumulative dose. The assumption is that 100 millisieverts is the exact same as 1 single dosage. And that assumes no healing takes place. So if we assume linearity, we assume no healing takes place. And that just makes no sense. I mean, if you go for a CT scan for a few years on end, your body has already recovered from the first CT scan. You've been exposed to radiation, but the radiation standard assumes you do not heal. It makes no sense. So I went this year to Ramsar, Iran, in Ramsar, you will find that the background radiation is 250 millisieverts a year. It is more than 10 times higher than what we consider safe in nuclear power plants. Now, Ramsar is this green area. That is me standing next to Yazdan Talishi. He is the world's most irradiated man. The man has absorbed the most radiation in human history, I believe, because he lives next to hot springs, radon springs coming up that is based on 250 millisieverts. And radiation standard says that this poor guy has to be dead. Behind him is a bunch of, in Persian it's called narangi trees. It's sour oranges. And here's me standing next to the holiday palace of the Shah of Iran. It's now a museum following the revolution. And they have these fruits, and I ate a radioactive fruit that comes from this millisieverts per year, 250, and I'm supposed to be dead based on this. So just based on what we know from background radiation, the nuclear safety standards cannot be true. They are too conservative. So how did this theory become accepted? In the 1950s, General Eisenhower, rightfully so, did his work as a good president, and he said, let's look into the effect of background radiation on the population. And the United States came up with the BEARS committee to look into radiation fallout, because they were doing a lot of radiation tests in Nevada in particular, and they were concerned about the population of Utah just next door. As it turns out, Utah has the least rate of cancer in the United States, but it's got the most background radiation. But anyway, the committee got staffed by geneticists who were funded by the, I mean, it sounds strange by saying it, but they were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And we know Rockefeller was invested in oil. And the committee based the recommendations on a few fruit flies that were shot with a high acute dose of radiation. And they rejected, and this is in their official communication, they actively rejected the data from the atomic bomb survivors. They rejected human data. And if you look at the atomic bomb survivors data, you find there's a dip in the curve. What is happening over here? These guys had radiation, but there's no linearity taking place. And this is what we would call radiation hormesis. It is the fact that a level of radiation, a certain level of it, might be beneficial to you. But the radiation safety standards tell you that no, that's not the case. So you find the same with the claim that gene mutation causes cancer. But if you look at gene mutation data through all ages on a population basis, you find that cancer increases linearly with age, but gene mutations are sometimes non-linear, sometimes decreases with age. So the LNT model assumes that increased mutations means an increase in cancers, but the relationship is very poor. It's actually inverse. We don't know if mutations even cause cancer. So the argument that radiation is a poor is a carcinogen is just flawed. It's flawed on the mutation theory of cancer. It's flawed on the basis, of just what we see in real life, because this 80-year-old man here did not have cancer. He was fine, and so were the people around him. So you have to ask questions. Why isn't Ramsar, the highest place with background radiation in the world, toxic? Why isn't Chernobyl a toxic wasteland? Why isn't Fukushima a toxic wasteland? And why did the Germans go to hot spas being paid for by their medical aid, where they're exposed to radiation, and yet they shut down nuclear power plants? And if you look at the amount of the deaths when moving to Fukushima versus the evacuated area in a big city, it's actually, from the air pollution in Shanghai alone, you have a higher chance of dying than in Fukushima in the restricted areas. And I always laugh. Tourists go to Fukushima with their Geico counters, but they are exposed to more radiation in the aeroplane than actually being in Fukushima. But that's based on the standard. So this is the tragedy of linear no threshold. During the evacuation at Fukushima, lots of people died. They did not die from radiation. Nobody has died from radiation in Fukushima. The Japanese government has reimbursed only one person who could prove in court he died from radiation. And it wasn't even clear if it was actually. So you can maybe make the case one person died from radiation in Fukushima. But lots of people died during the evacuation. That was also true of Chernobyl. Now, before the BEARS committee in the 1950s, nuclear power was about half the price it is today. Just to construct, it was actually a third of the price if you look at some of the overruns. It's about half the price on average. of what it was before we imposed this regulation on the industry. Before the 1950s, people were building lots of nuclear power stations, and the costs were coming down. And the oil industry saw this as a threat to the interest. That's why they staffed the committee with geneticists that were paranoid about radiation. And since then, the cost of nuclear reactors have gone up. And we know from building nuclear plants, the biggest cost is during construction, is during your safety. And I make the argument you can relax some of the safety, you can fire some of the workers. Okay. This was written by Dr. Wade Allison after Fukushima, and it's in the BBC. I think it's written to the BBC. He said we should stop running away from radiation. That people worry about radiation because they cannot feel it. However, nature has a solution. In recent years, it has been found that living cells replace and mend themselves in various ways to recover from a radiation dose. These clever mechanisms kick in within hours and rarely fail, except for when they are overloaded, as in Chernobyl, where most of the emergency workers who received a dose greater than 4,000 millisieverts over a few hours died within weeks. So it's true. High levels of radiation, there's no question about it, it's dangerous. I'm talking about low levels, which is most of the what takes place in most of Fukushima and most of Chernobyl. And he says, however, patients receiving a course of radiotherapy usually get a dose of 2,000 millisieverts to vital healthy tissue close to the treated tumor. This tissue survives only because the treatment is spread over many days, giving healthy cells time to repair or replace. So radiotherapists know this. They shoot somebody with a concentrated high dose of radiation. They give the patient time to recover. And if the cancer comes back, he goes back for some treatment to bring the cancer into remission. But radiation safety standards at nuclear plants assumes this doesn't take place. It assumes your body does not heal. In this way, many patients, get to enjoy further rewarding years of life, even after many vital organs have received an equivalent dose of 2,000 years, dose above the internationally recommended annual limit, which makes this limit unreasonable. Okay, so what am I arguing for? I'm arguing for radiation hormesis. It's a paradigm change in public health. Okay. I make the argument that the precautionary principle has no valid scientific basis. It's a legal argument. The assumption that we're going to play it safe has consequences. Because if you play it too safe, as we saw at Fukushima, you evacuate people and you killed them. But if you take into account that there is a healing taking place, right? If you have a sunburn, you tan a bit, and that tan protects you against a new radiation, new UV radiation. We say, well, there's a healing process and an improvement in the organism. We call that hormesis. And only after a certain level, we argue for 100 millisieverts, that's relaxed the norms by a factor of 10, then, you are definitely in a dangerous zone. And if healing takes place, clearly linearity is wrong. And yeah, thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Excellent. That was dense and that was good. You went through a lot of very good material there, and I guess, like usual, what we'll do is open up for a dialogue, a Q&A. So if people have had questions floating in the back of their mind or anything like that, now is the time to throw your name out. And ideally, I would ask people to put up their digital hands, as Karen in Ontario just did, or put your name in the chat box, and I'll call upon you that way. Karen, it's all yours, but you're on mute. Everyone is by default on mute.
Great. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. Great. Okay. Yeah. So hi, Hügo. Very interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions. I'm just wondering what your opinion is about these two things. One is about the health aspects of things like electric cars on humans and other mammals. I'm kind of wondering about having a huge battery in my car and how that might affect me. And the other question is about offshore wind. And I have heard, and you can correct me if this is wrong, that it creates a vibration, creates vibrational problems for aquatic creatures. So do you know anything about those two things?
I've heard the vibrational problems issue as well. I have to look in the data to make an informed opinion on that, because I remember there was a story going around that they kill a lot of birds as well, but when you actually compare to the fossil fuel plants, it's actually less. So this is the big challenge you have in the energy industry. I've now been in it for just over 10 years, And I can tell you nobody's honest, including the nuclear guys. Okay. Everyone is trying to spin a story to take down the other guy. If offshore wind has an advantage, it's got a 40% capacity factor over onshore wind, which I think is 20%. So it's definitely got an advantage. It's definitely got its benefits. It might be that it does some damage to the environment. I'd be surprised if it doesn't. I'd be surprised if any technology doesn't do damage to the environment. But the question is it an acceptable limit or not? I have no idea on that one. As for your electric car and to be worried about that, I mean, I don't think you should be more concerned than being worried about the petrol car, for example. I mean, there's bad and good things to it. The interesting thing about hormesis, it's not just a phenomenon for radiation. It's a phenomenon for all exposure substances, even arsenic. Now, I'm not recommending that people take arsenic, but it's a fact that if you take a little bit of arsenic and you recover from it, you probably have protection against a new arsenic poison in the future. And that might be true for all exposure. And I'm actually arguing that's how we should do public health. We should figure out what limit of the substance is beneficial to us, right? And then we should put our regulatory limits to that one. So, I would not worry about your electric car. I've heard of people saying that if electric car catches fire, how do you put it out? There's probably going to be some safety risks to it. But, again, compared to what? Is it worse than a petrol car? I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
All right, Hassan, go for it. It's all yours.
Great. No, thank you. And that was an awesome presentation. A lot of eye-opening things. Wasn't too surprised to hear it, but it was presented really well. Thank you. So my question was, you're showing an interesting graph that was saying there was a time where there was productivity increases. There was a lot being invested. And then things got more expensive. The context I'm coming from, I'm not an energy expert at all. I work in the digital space, but we interact with a lot of nuclear providers. And what we found is if you talk to the ones in the West, it's all around either refurbishment or keeping the old thing running or shutting it down. But then in the East, there's massive building going on, like hundreds of new plants being powered. So I'm really interested to hear if you have any insights on where have things gone in terms of where the bar of good is, in terms of how productive things have become. Because I'm not sure anymore living in Canada that we're seeing the best of what nuclear power can provide. So any comments you have on that would be interesting. Thank you.
So of all the Western countries, I would say Canada is the best in nuclear at this stage. Okay, for Western countries, at least your government is thinking of investing into it. In France, we built a lot of reactors in the 1980s at a very short period of time, and then we just stopped training engineers. We forgot about it. The politicians were making commitments of phasing out nuclear without knowing what it was, really. It was just virtuous things. And now they made a decision a few years ago, they want to rebuild it. But you have to catch up. I mean, I was looking at statistics in Japan, or studies in Japan, saying for Japan, if they want to go and build new nuclear power stations, under current assumptions, it will take 15 years. Because you have to get the engineers trained, you have to get the industries right. It's a big industrial process. Now, I'm an advocate for that. The Chinese, I've looked into that, and they've said, well, guys, a few years ago, they made a decision saying we need to plan long-term for nuclear power. So we need to start training our engineers and training our expertise and getting our supply chains ready. And that's why they're building it. So at this stage, if I was Canada and I want to build nuclear plants, I would ask the South Koreans to help me because they know how to build on time. And the tragedy is the new power station that was built in Dubai, I forgot the name now, I can't pronounce because Arabic starts with a B, was built by South Koreans, but the laborers came from South Africa, from America, and from Canada. Okay, so it's our engineers who got jobs over there, got paid a lot of money to come and build it in other countries. And it's the same, I've looked into the El Daba plant in Egypt. It's American contractor doing the quality control. So sometimes I question even if we have the skills, but I don't think we have the political leadership to get behind it. But we need to know if we want to turn it around, you need to make a decade, 2 decade commitment. And the problem in our politics is you can easily get a demagogue in tomorrow morning that's just going to shut the whole thing down, and then we start at zero again. And that's sort of where we are all the time. I mean, in nuclear, I would like to see us stop building these pressure water reactors because there are safety issues. It's like and start going to molten salt and different types of reactors. But these things all stay on paper. We never get to build them, and we need to ask why. And I think it's good you're asking the question, but I don't have all the answers.
Jerry, are you there? Yeah,
I
we'll
think you'll
wait
be
on
able to.
Jerry. Let's go to Nathan.
So, yeah, what a fascinating presentation you gave. And my question is, I understand that Russia's kind of at the forefront of nuclear, more modern and efficient nuclear powered facilities generation. And what's the possibilities of them working with France in the future to revitalize the energy sector?
Well, I mean, I'm in favor of more cooperation with Russia anyways. And it's because, you know, if you punish a country for invading the war and condemnable as the war is, you harden their leadership. So I'm in favor of that anyways. There is many European reactors are still dependent on Russia for refueling at the moment, but our politicians are now talking of sanctioning them, and I'm always I'm very skeptical against doing that, just for the political ramifications. But yeah, Russia trains a lot of engineers, and Rosatom is a good company. Whatever one thinks of it, it's a decision Putin made a few years ago to keep staying onto nuclear. And I know they are building the reactors in Bangladesh and in Egypt at the moment. So they actually managed to outsource the reactors. And it's basically Russia, South Korea, and now China that's building it. And another country that's looking into it is Iran. Iran has said they will develop small-scale reactors. It remains to be seen, because a lot of countries have made commitments in the past, and have they gotten there? But yeah, I'm in favor of cooperation with them. Politically, I don't know with this war how that's going to work out.
Well, this is way beyond my understanding, but didn't they develop something with plutonium in waste landfills? Or I'm not developing, but there was talk about that. What's the horizon on
There
that?
was a talk of making breather reactors where they can recycle nuclear fuel.
Yeah.
And I think the United States had a program, and Canada was doing that as well at one stage. So, but I don't know if they ever got it off track. Even the Russian reactors being built is still the old classical pressure water reactor. And it's basically a submarine reactor that they put on land. That's where it started.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in with a quick question, since you just touched on breeder reactors, and one of the most pervasive arguments against nuclear power that I tend to encounter is the question of nuclear waste. What can we do with nuclear waste? Do we have to just bury it for thousands of years like we're kind of doing? Or and there's really not, and for many years I myself didn't have a strong idea that it could be reprocessed, that waste itself is a bit of a misnomer. So I was hoping, Hügo, with your expertise, could you maybe summarily explain the nuclear closing of the cycle a little bit for people to get a better idea? Because since I know India and China both are pioneering and moving forward on that angle, which we used to be looking at in the 70s, and we stopped.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with waste is just it still has energy, it still has radioactive decay, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, so you can still untap that. That's the sort of short of it. Whether it's economically viable has always been a question, and the United States has just concluded that it's too expensive to do it. It's more expensive, it's cheaper just to build one. Maybe there just isn't enough waste, because the waste is not that much, you know, it's highly concentrated. And your solution in the States has been, we keep them in, I think, spent in dry casks. And in France, we keep them in swimming pools. Basically, we have a large swimming pool at La Hague. We put all of them to cool down. And that swimming pool is basically still heating. Now, the question people have had is, why don't we just use that heat to make energy? And that's sort of the short of it. And basically, we're waiting for it to go down. Of course, when you start reprocessing the waste, there is a chance that you will have higher enriched fuel. And that's always been a question mark in terms of nuclear weapons. Okay. So that is there's not a good or bad side here. Can you manage it properly? Yes, maybe. No, I don't know. But again, these things stay on paper. I mean, I've worked only on the classical reactors, you know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jerry has figured out his unmute issue. So Jerry, it is all yours again.
Okay, can you hear me now, Matt?
Yes.
Okay, good. Oh, Hügo, that was a wonderful presentation. That was very good. I just wanted to ask you a question, because here in Canada, they're trying to pass laws to force us all to buy electric cars. And I don't think they've thought this thing through, because in terms of the production and maintenance, they haven't even thought about it. And I've been following the issue of the batteries because there's such an enormous demand for metals to build these batteries. And I think you mentioned it yourself. You hear horror stories of like in the Congo and other places, using child labor and horrible environmental conditions to extract the minerals in these mines, and they're still fighting over it in the Congo. But what I've been trying to follow is the idea of hydrogen, not as a fuel, but they're working on using hydrogen as a battery, sort of the electrolysis to generate the electricity for that, which seems to be a more promising one than this other insane operation with the batteries. And I just wondered if you had read anything about that or what your thoughts were on it, if you could. Thanks.
Sure. So just going to point out the child labor issue. It is true, okay, but it's only in 10% of the Congo. It's only in 2 provinces. The rest of the Congo, it's not the case. Okay, so the majority of lithium from the Congo is not child labor, and that's where there's civil wars. So the answer would be stop the civil war to stop the child labor. But we never get to that point. But as for hydrogen, you see, I'm skeptical because to make hydrogen, as you say, using electrolysis, you lose about 75% of the energy just making the hydrogen. And then you need to transport it, right? And then you need to make sure it's under pressure. That takes more energy. So, you've got all these losses before you start using it. And what happens is your quantity of fresh water that is required runs into the same issue as you have with the batteries, because it's a low energy dense solution. So the lower the energy dense, the higher the material demand. So you're going to demand on fresh water. Now, Canada has a lot of fresh water, and maybe, you can do it. But South Africa, with its 25th driest country in the world, for us to make hydrogen from inland water is very difficult. We can maybe put it at the ocean, and there's a question of desalination of water, and maybe there's a back process for that. So I've heard people saying they're going to invest into that, but I want to see these things work before I put my, put my vote behind any of these things. I'm all for saying let's throw a little bit of money at it and play with it, because maybe there's solutions and creative things that come out of it, and you just don't know, right? But I'm skeptical of a government, you say in Canada, trying to force everyone to buy electrical cars, because Canada, as I understand it, you've got long distances to travel. Electrical cars are great for traveling in cities, but if you're going to travel across the provinces on an electrical battery, where are you going to charge it? How long is that charge going to last you? You've got all these questions that plays into it. And I'm not so sure if it's always the wisest thing happening.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It would only make sense if certain people in Ottawa didn't want people moving around that much long distances. But we couldn't imagine that intention being there. No. Stephen has a question on the abiotic theory of oil. Stephen.
Thanks, Hugo, for an excellent lecture. I really enjoyed that. I assume you're familiar with the abiotic theory of oil, that it occurs, regenerates naturally, and is not millennia-old, decayed forest and all that rubbish. So if that's actually true, and let's up the ante a bit, and we accept that the whole CO2 causing climate change is a fraudulent argument, how would either or both of these change the calculus in terms of rational energy policy for humanity going forward?
Well, I mean, if oil is really abiotic, and I'm skeptical about that, and climate is not a concern, then you sort of answered it. Why change anything, right? If that's really true. But as for it being abiotic, I read Tommy Gould's book, The Myth of Fossil Fuels. He was the scientist who proposed it.
Yep.
And he was, I think, proven correct for methane. There is clear evidence that some form of methane is abiotic. But as for oil, the skepticism against that has been that oil is found very close to the surface in shallow deposits. And the question is, how would theoretically it be generated from pressure inside of the earth? So maybe oil isn't abiotic, but some elements of methane might be, but also not all of it. But it's still an open question among geologists. I'm not sure if you should put an energy policy on the basis that the theory might be true or might be false, So I'm all for exploring more forms of energy just for the sake of doing it. But with all of these things, and it sort of gets to your point, we are competing against oil and gas because they're so efficient at what they do. So whatever you're going to use to replace them, you're going to compete against a very efficient product. And that's why you always see a bit of a rebound curve. We see a little bit of electrical energy in consumption or renewable in consumption, and then we see a little bit of oil and gas afterwards because the price corrects itself. And that's how the market has always been moved. So far, none of these technologies have ever been a threat to the fossil fuel industry, except nuclear power when the Rockefellers passed that dodgy law. And that was only for electricity generation, right? But thus far, it's not a threat to the oil companies. And that's why the oil companies, they don't mind going along with the climate narrative. Because it's not, they know if these things don't work, we're just going to sell it for a markup. And we've seen that happen so many times. So.
Okay, thank you.
We have a follow-up question from Jerry.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I just had another thought, Hügo, that, this whole anti-carbon nonsense, it seems that Western Europe and North America are the ones swallowing this stuff. In the so-called global South, in South America, Africa, and Asia, they don't seem to be buying it because they realize if they go with it, their population is going to die. They're going to collapse. So if Europe and North America don't come out of their insanity, what do you predict is going to happen to Europe and North America if they keep on this nonsense?
Well, you're going to have more protests like we had in France. And then afterwards, the same politicians who say they're in favor of it go and bring down the price of oil again. It's astonishing to me the level of almost religious fanaticism that's gone on in Europe and North America. Because you say in South Africa, I guarantee you this is not even an issue for discussion. I mean, we care about poverty and development because that's where we are economically speaking. Although I must say some third world dictators like Sisi in Egypt, for example, have climbed onto this issue to get what they call climate reparations. And they basically using that to buy more weapons to oppress their own populations. So it's really as if they're standing with their hands begging the Western governments for more money, and they're getting it by saying the right things in front of the camera. But as of implementing policy, it doesn't happen in the third world. And then, in Europe and North America, it's as if the politicians are fighting against the laws of economics sometimes. Yeah, but as I said in the beginning, I'm not against any of these technologies, but the excessive push for them, I question sometimes the logic of this whole thing. Why now? Why this story? Why is it so carbon obsessed? I honestly don't get it. And unfortunately, a lot of this stuff comes from Canada. I mean, Maurice Strong, who was he was one of the founders of the environmental movement and the IPCC. He was big onto these things. And I think Canadians will have to tell me what went wrong or what happened over there.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Now, Maurice Strong is one of the worst gifts Canada ever gave to the world, but he was also devoted. I think he was recruited early on to the Rockefeller machine when he was a young 20-something-year-old working in New York, and he was amazingly, he found a bit of he discovered his life's mission, and he was deployed back, and all of a sudden found himself the CEO of several mining cartels in the late 50s before he headed Power Corps, and then worked to lead the fight for a nuclear moratorium, which somehow qualified him to become the head of Ontario Hydropower, which oversaw like 50% of the nuclear power of Ontario, which he pretty much devoted himself to shutting it all down. And it's a miracle that it was rehabilitated after his untimely departure, or very timely departure, I should say. So
well, I would say that I mean he's not the only one. This is the problem with this climate issue. I mean, there's so many interests that have jumped onto it. I mean, it's the only issue I can think of that can bring Marxist economists and billionaires together, and they're all everyone is sort of trying to find his own piece of the pie in this climate issue, and they're proposing policies that have clearly nothing to do with climate change or emissions or energy for that matter. Everyone has got a pet theory, whether it's a 15-minute city or whether it is reparations for the third world or whatever story they're dreaming up tomorrow. They're going to find a way to swing it to support the climate story. And then you're going to say, CO2. I mean, I saw the other one the other day, carbon emissions, targets feminists the most, things of this sort, or carbon emissions cause heart attacks, things that's got nothing to do with it, or it causes the Syrian civil war. And you ask yourself what's going on over here, and it's very difficult to explain that phenomenon. I don't know. I mean, if it's just about energy, I can understand it. I can explain to you, or give you maybe a rational path to get to net zero, assuming you want to do that. There's a way to do it, and it might not be so difficult. It might be difficult, but it's going to cost you, and you can do that. But I get the impression sometimes it's not really about that. It's about, people just pushing whatever political theory they've got.
Just the other day on CBC News, I was listening to a broadcast where they trotted out a bunch of experts all explaining how Russia was the cause of, or the driving cause of climate change because of their war in Ukraine. And full deadpan seriousness, these experts were coming out actually trying to persuade a gullible population that Russia's the cause of global warming now. It doesn't matter. They'll just spin whatever the argument is.
There was a cartoon I saw which showed Joe Biden falling off a bicycle and yelling, "Damn you, Putin." So everything is blamed on if questions, I have a couple of very simplistic questions to ask if nobody else is waiting.
No, Harinder, go for it.
So thank you, Chris. Am I getting your name right, the scientist?
Hugo? That's Hugo.
Hugo, sorry, Hugo. So unlike some of the other people, I found your presentation a little challenging, I admit it, because the last time I took science was in high school about 50 years ago. So a couple of the questions I had will seem very simplistic. We know we are being told that CO2 raises the climate, the temperature of the planet. And yet what I recall from high school is CO2 is inhaled by plants or processed by plants in the process of photosynthesis, and they break it up and create the oxygen that we need and breathe. Is that a correct? Am I being very simplistic, or is that?
No, that's completely correct. I mean, it's look, the basic science is this: if you double CO2 in the atmosphere, you get about 1 degree of warming for every doubling of CO2. That's if you do a small controlled experiment. If you do that on a planetary scale, it's questionable if that even happens, right? Then on top of that, you have what they call water vapor feedback. So it's another greenhouse gas that theoretically will increase more warming. We don't know what that function looks like, so it's assumed. And then that goes into computer models, and then they predict all these fantasies of the end of the world, right? But at the same time, you're entirely correct that CO2 is good for plants. It causes plants to grow. Plants can also grow when it's a little bit warmer. Some of them enjoy a bit of warm. So is a bit of warm the end of the world? These are questions that they would never ask. My question has always been, so what? The planet has never had the same temperature anyways. If it's a little bit warmer, it's not the end of the world. I really question whether it's going to cause planetary collapse and all these dreams, because not even the IPCC says that. And if you actually read the IPCC report, the scientific part, it's not scary. But what happens is you have the scientific part, and then they have a policy summary, a summary for policymakers, and then they have media headlines, and then they play the game of telephone to activists and then to politicians. And by the time you and I get the message, it's so far away from what the basic science actually says.
And as you pointed out, one of the mechanisms they use for all of this is these sophisticated computer modelers, either in London or wherever, who are getting grants from the very people that want to spread scare stories. And this was not only about climate change, this was done for COVID, 65 million deaths or whatever, tens of millions will die, etc., etc. And all the basic science about natural immunity. You pointed about hormesis, we being able to heal from and learn from a limited amount. That same theory is true of natural immunity. You get herd immunity, and all that is simply buried by a dictatorial narrative, and the whole fundamental basic science gets buried with the complicit media, etc.
Well, I say the theory of hormesis, immunology is a good example. You're exposed to a few germs, and you're probably going to be a bit sick in the beginning, and you recover, right? And then you can take it again. That's constant across the field. That's why I argue that this precautionary measure, because that's what the root of this fear is about. We cannot increase the CO2 because it assumes we cannot adapt to it. Okay, and therefore it is a catastrophe on a planetary scale. Or we cannot be exposed to any viruses, therefore we need to hide in our home. I mean, it's the same logic. It's you need to run away from the problem as opposed to asking, okay, what level of this can I accept? What is my threshold before it becomes dangerous? And if you do that for a lot of places in public policy, you will find a lot of these environmental policies will become more sane, in my view. And, things will become a little bit cheaper as well. And a lot of medications, would actually be approved that are being rejected because they work on a very small threshold, but we assume they don't, so we throw them out. There's a lot of applications for hormesis. It's broader than this.
And we ignore the fact that the immune system is itself built on an interaction with these viruses and bacteria and fungi. It's designed by nature to function that way and improve itself. And of course, one of the agendas is to drive out all alternative therapies, medicines, supplements, etc., because only big pharma has the answers that can protect us from, and to which we must therefore be forced.
But you see, on the basis of this LNT model, in terms of radiation, you've got nuclear safety agencies, you've got the International Atomic Energy Agency that's based on that. Most likely, if what I say is true, nuclear weapons, while they can cause a big blast, we don't have to be afraid of the radiation fallout anymore. So all those inspectors will go away. A lot of the guys in the military spending. I mean, there's a lot of people making money out of a bad model there. And it was as true of big pharma as it is of this one, right? As you just pointed out. And this is the problem.
So there was another silly question I had. You probably have seen the Dr. Strangelove movie and the crazy Nazi at the end who says we can survive for 100 years underground where the radiation will never reach. And then the president asks, well, how long will it be before we can come back out? And he calculates on his slide rule and says maybe 100 years. So you would not agree that it would take 100 years to clear radiation?
No, because people lived in Hiroshima and Nagasaki right after the blast and they didn't have cancer. So there's two controlled experiments for you, repeat it. You may be a few weeks, I don't know, depending on the level, but that's it. I mean, Hiroshima, what I'm saying is correct here. Fukushima and Chernobyl should never have been evacuated, probably never have been evacuated, or if they're evacuated, give people a choice. Tell them, look, there's a thing coming, and those who are scared can go, and those, if you told people at Fukushima, you would each receive something like 3 CT scans, which was the equivalent dose. Most people would say, okay, I'll take 3 CT scans and set them at my home. Other people say, I'm scared, I'm going to run away. You give them the choice, you don't kill people during evacuation. It was the same with COVID. If you told young people at COVID, your chance of dying was something, I think mine was something like 2 in 200,000 or something. It was a ridiculous small number.
0.2% was their own
average,
statistic right up to the point they produced these vaccines. 0.2.
And for somebody my age, I'm 33 now. I mean, it was negligible. I'm healthy and I'm young and everything. I didn't take the vaccine because I got the virus and it was nothing. And so, what was the point of all of what we did? Nothing. It's just to make money.
Well, the point was alluded to by Matthew when he suggested maybe they don't have. He was asking this ironic question that they don't really want us to limit travel distances, do we? In fact, the 15-minute city or whatever that they tried in Oxford is an example that they want to impose these kinds of limits on us. And that, the conspiracy, they call it conspiracy theory, but people are afraid that they're trying to move us completely to electrical cars because we can be shut off from, the cars can be shut down because they're linked to a driverless software and so on.
But wait, I mean, you can install that software in a petrol car as well. So I don't know if that's going to be much better.
That's a good point.
It's a question of any technology. It's like a hammer. I can use a hammer to build a house, or I can use it to knock you over the head. And it's the question of the intention of the person behind it. Even these 15-minute cities. I mean, I'm staying in a place in Paris where they're proposing it now, and some of it might be great if I could walk to the town and back and things. But again, as with all of these things, it's something that started in city planning. That was maybe a good idea to say people need to walk a little bit more. I think most people would agree it's good for public health. But then the fanatics start climbing onto this issue. And then they listen to this and that. And before you know it, it becomes a demon. And it's the same with the vaccines. It's the same with climate, I think.
No, I think the famous analogy of the hammer is always an important poetic image to hold in the mind, because a lot of times we fall into the trap of blaming fire for the arsonists, and we forget to look at the arsonists, and instead we fall for like, let's all just ban hammers, and then we won't have any more murders by hammer anymore, and that's always a mistake. But and I see that too with the fourth industrial revolution discussions, and there's a fear because of the misuse of a lot of these technologies by ill-intentioned forces that it's the technology of machine learning or automation or 3D printing which is to blame, and the world would be better if we didn't have these things. And it's like, or how about we try to fight for a moral society instead of that would use these things well. So it was a good reminder there. Hassan has one last question, and I think that might be a great place to end this session today.
For sure. He mentioned initially in comments about getting a better balance between safety and operating effectively, like we've gone too far over. So the context I'm coming from is, at least in North America, right? You've got 5 to 10 million parts minimum, I think, in these facilities. There's a 6-layer supply chain between the prime contractor and whoever's supplying the little bit or widget way down. 4 or 5 regulators poking their noses in. And we had a few conversations. It turns out that the cents per kilowatt hour we're paying is significantly impacted by the regulatory weight of trying to answer all of the regulatory check marks in this crazy puzzle palace that is being set up after you build the thing and just try and get it operating. So my question was, any examples of countries or regions that are doing it in your mind in a more sane way?
Yeah. So I can show you anecdotal examples, because I think in a broad they're all insane. But for example, in China, if you dismantle a nuclear power station, okay, you've got high-end radioactive waste, and the argument is, we take the high-end waste and we put it in a depository, we treat it, which makes complete sense. But whatever is left, we just take a diamond blade and we cut up the concrete and the steel and we dismantle it. We basically explode the thing, and then we put mud on it and we relieve it. So basically, some people have said many countries accept LNT, but they actually in practice violate LNT. France came out of a study in 2005. The French, I think it's the Radiologist Society, but they basically said, they made a population-based study, and they said, well, below 100 millisievert, we have no indication of cancer. But what was interesting is their conclusion. The conclusion is, even though we don't see it, it might not be there. Okay, so they basically accept that the model is true, but they didn't do it. But they are slowly applying some of these things to it. Now, what you alluded to there with regulatory things is what they call a LARA. It's called as low as reasonably acceptable. That is what all nuclear power stations on. So the nuclear regulator says, we are going to set the standard of how low you need to bring your radiation, which is close to 0. And we're going to find ways for you to achieve it. Okay. As opposed to saying to the guy designing it, you tell us how you're going to do it, and these are the limits, and just as long as you respect it, that's fine. So we do the whole thing backwards, and that's where you get this entire pile of paperwork that I think half of it's useless, frankly. But the people who are the biggest offenders of these things are the people working in the nuclear industry themselves, because they know that their jobs are linked to this thing. So you've got a very evil demon being created by this whole regulatory process.
Thanks, much appreciated. Makes tons of sense, and I like that you put your finger on the essence of the thing that's making it a little crazy. Appreciate it.
One follow-up question about electrical cars. Hugo, you mentioned that in Canada you would need a lot of recharging stations to be able to travel. But there's also the matter of the timing of the charge. Currently, I think it takes at least 2 to 3 hours. Is it ever possible, or has any modeling been done to show that this technology can improve to the point where a car could charge, let's say, in 15 minutes? Because right now you can pull up at a gas station. At Costco, maybe you have to wait 5-10 minutes, but in most gas stations, you can get in and out within 5 minutes. Whereas here, if millions of people were on electrical cars and they had to get recharged, the whole question of where all this recharging capacity is going to come from. And because this is based on electricity, the entire grid has to be capable of supplying it, and the technology for charging has to be dramatically improved. So has there been any kind of studies done on that?
Answer is no, no, and no, to be honest. And these are the obvious practical problems that no politician wants to admit to. I mean, just like assuming we get just basic charging stations everywhere, that puts more electricity on the grid. That doubles, if not triples, the power supply. That's more power stations. That's more materials. That's more minerals. And they want to do this all in, I mean, what's it now, 2023, in 7 years. They want to achieve most of that. I mean, and you need to train the electricians, you need to train the civil engineers, you need to train the workers. All of these things added up. So somebody did, I've seen some calculations, and don't know how legitimate they are, but they worked out that just to achieve net zero, you need to employ something like 90% of all your workers in the electrical system in one way or another. And that does not seem to me like a very good way of allocating labor. So I think what's going to happen in practice is Canada's going to do some of it. It's going to somewhat work. And then people will just revert back to what works and what's practical. I mean, I don't see why anyone in Canada would want to give up a car to travel long distance for the simple reason you've just said. And, you know, what do you do about that? I don't see how you can travel across these massive distances you've got on an electrical charge. And how many hours do you have to wait to recharge your car full? I mean, it's absurd. And then, you know, maybe we double the time. We have the time of charging. Great. That's still not more efficient than if you, you know, argue a minute or two that you use to fill up your car. So I don't see how they can do it.
Well, this is we are being told this is this may be intended supply chain destruction, not just disruption, but destruction. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, then, yeah. I mean, the level of energy illiteracy in government, as well as in the population more broadly, is just absurd, where people actually say, and then they believe the words that they say, that this net zero thing can be attained by having our entire grid supplied by windmills and solar panels. But it's like, even if you think about the electric car thing, most people are going to be charging their cars at night anyway. So good luck finding the solar panels that are going to supply energy, you know, throughout the night, or windmills that are going to be able to guarantee provide that electricity, which there's not a lot of wind most nights anyway. So they're going to need to still have so-called dirty, energy plants providing the electricity to the grid anyway while you're charging up your car all night. There's so many levels of contradiction. It's just wild. It's wild.
Well, you see, there's a challenge we have in Western countries. We tell ourselves that the story of the Industrial Revolution has been a success of markets and rule of law and democracy, and maybe rightfully so. I don't doubt that property rights in particular. I don't doubt that those things played a big role. But when the Japanese elites studied the Industrial Revolution, they immediately realized what was going on, which was it was a conversion of coal. They stopped burning wood and they started burning coal. And that's why the Asian elites are ahead of us on this issue, because they understand, at least intuitively, energy. And look at Korea. I mean, South Korea is stopping their wind and solar expansion. They're going to expand nuclear at this stage. Japan is recommitting to nuclear. China is recommitting to nuclear. So they understand the process of the Industrial Revolution very well. And it's not just China, it's all of those countries. They figured it out. And we are asking ourselves, what did we do? And we're not asking them, how do you see us? And I think if people are a little bit more energy literate, I mean, I don't expect everyone to be, an engineer working in the system. I think things will make more sense. A good book I think I can recommend is by Václav Smil. He wrote a book, what was the book now called? It's on the energy transitions, okay? And he's got a very good book pointing this out. Also, Tony Wrigley's book, Energy and the English Industrial Revolution, more or less say the same thing that I've been saying right now. And so, yeah, I think there is a elite illiteracy on energy, and this allows us to make all these foolish decisions. I mean, give an example is the most absurd. John Kerry was in Africa a few months ago. He went through an Africa tour, and he was in the DRC. Now, in the Congo, something like, I think 50-60% of all people don't have electricity, just don't have, they've never had. And he says to them, our priority is fighting climate change. So he's speaking to the population in Africa and telling them your priority is to stop your carbon footprint. Where their priority is hunger, they don't have a carbon footprint. If they had one, they would be healthier. And this is the attitude that is becoming entrenched in the World Bank and the IMF and all these institutions. And the Chinese, I think, are looking at this and they say, well, thank you guys very much. We can now go to the Africans and offer them infrastructure. We're going to win diplomatically. And what are you guys thinking? You're going totally off nuts and crazy here.
Yeah. No, that's a good way of looking at it, because ultimately this stupidity is causing, in a certain sense, a sort of greater potential of sanity just by virtue of the people couldn't imagine a decade ago or 20 years ago how much dumber the energy and the political expression of this type of strategy could take us. But here we are talking about eating bugs to stop global warming and going back to 15th century energy sources like windmills, instead of using what's tried and true, which allowed us to have to become first world countries. We just forgot. And so when you have most of the world, including Africa, Latin America, Asia, Russia, increasingly going for nuclear, going for the sorts of things that we did when we were still sober decades and decades ago, and showing that their population is living longer, happier, healthier lives, creating abundance. Meanwhile, we're eating bugs, living in scarcity. People will increasingly ask, well, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing the thing that's causing abundance? So hopefully, hopefully, if we can avoid some of the calamities of the consequences of a nuclear war, I think that this is naturally going to, like you said, clear itself up, because you can only expect people to abide by stupidity for so long before they'll end up going back to what works,
The way I'm optimistic that people push back, well, first of all, I saw what happened here in France in 2019. I mean, I stay in France, but I'm originally from South Africa. People were just protesting, and they were more or less getting along with this, sort of going with the flow, who cares, until it starts hitting their pocket. And energy always hits the pocket of the electorate. So I won't be surprised if it's the Trudeau government in Canada that turns around on these things. Not because they want to, because they have to, again, with the wind and solar stuff, I'm not against them. They have their place, and we probably need to expand them in many areas. I'm not against that. But I think just the logic of running your entire country's electrical system on two, and maybe a third source if it's hydro, from a strategic national security point of view, from supply chain point of view, from all those point of views, just make no sense to me. And I do think we're seeing pushback, so I'm more optimistic about it. And also the Eastern Europeans are not going along with this. Poland is committed to nuclear power. Estonia is committed to it. They understand, hopefully, what's going on over here. So it seems to be a problem that's confined to North America, a little bit in France, and a lot in the UK. And, if the bubble bursts, I think we'll have more sensible policy. And that's, I guess, why we need to have more conversations like these.
Mm-hmm. Well, for that, thank you very much, Hügo, for infusing this nice, heavy, high dose of reason, which I really appreciate. I think this has really increased our psycho-spiritual health immensely and given us more tools to go into battle, with the bedwetters and the fearmongers who are just afraid, living in fear and ignorance. So we really do need to find a way to elegantly do battle with these things, and you've given us a lot of tools. So thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for taking another Saturday afternoon to accompany us on this voyage of discovery. Next week, we're going to continue this with something on global warming. Actually, I'm not going to say anything more about it because it's a bit fluid, but there will be something big next Sunday at 2 p.m. So I hope everyone can make it. And Hügo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, Hügo. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.